The Hong Kong Institute of Chartered Secretaries recently held its 10th Biennial Corporate Governance Conference. In this session of the conference, we hear from two speakers on the topic of management and corporate governance, hands-on or handcuffed. First, Mr. Lincoln Leong, CEO of the MTR Corporation, shares how his company balances the expectations of stakeholders with regulatory requirements and a changing external environment.
What I'd like to do over the next 20 minutes or so is to give a brief overview of how we at MTR sees corporate governance. And from a management perspective, are we handcuffed or are we hands-on? Well, firstly, and congratulations, I understand this is the 10th anniversary of this particular corporate governance get-together, seminar, and meeting. If one looks back over the last 10 years, there's been very significant changes on a global basis. Also, not surprisingly, those global changes have been reflected here significantly in Hong Kong. Business in all aspects have become much more international, much more global. To give you an example, at MTR, 10 years ago, we were operating really in one jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction, not surprisingly, is our home market here in Hong Kong. Today, 10 years later, we're working in 5 very distinct and very different jurisdictions. We're working here in Hong Kong, mainland of China, Australia, in Sweden, as well as in the UK. In that same period, the regulatory environment has also become much more complicated. Regulations within countries, regulations of cross-border flows, regulations between countries. And the expectation of stakeholders. And stakeholders go way beyond just shareholders. The expectation of stakeholders, high originally, getting even higher. For us, we have many stakeholders. Our colleagues, our employees, a key group, our travelers, the traveling public, not only here in Hong Kong, but the 5 million passengers that we carry every day outside of Hong Kong as well. And in between all that, trust in big businesses have significantly eroded over the last 10 years. A number of global events have led to that, perhaps stemming from events like the global financial crisis. But that also is reflected on what we're seeing and what I think many of you here in Hong Kong have seen, that erosion of trust that's been given, or the erosion of trust that people have in big businesses. So, in that environment, and with those changes over the last 10 years, what does that mean from our perspective in terms of corporate governance? Well, firstly, the definition of corporate governance over that same time frame has also become much more complex. From 1992, from the first Cadbury report, the definition, which still holds today, the system by which companies are directed and controlled, very much focused on management, very much focused on interaction between management, board, and shareholders. 8 years later, in the year 2000, also a report from Sir Adrian Cadbury, that breadth of stakeholders, that volume of stakeholders have increased significantly. We're now looking at balancing the interests of different groups, balancing economic and social goals, balancing and aligning the interests of individuals, corporations, and society. So not only has the world, not surprisingly, become much more complex and complicated, even the way that one looks at corporate governance has also significantly evolved over that period of time. So what does that mean in that 10-year period? What we see is an increase in the complexity. There's a lot more compliance requirements. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, much of corporate governance revolved around processes, procedures? Do you have an internal audit process? Do you have an internal audit procedure? Do you have a nomination committee? And there was much more focus, as I mentioned before, between three important groups of stakeholders: shareholders, board, and management. Things have become much more complex. The regulatory requirement, as we mentioned, much greater scrutiny. The expectation now is not just doing everything right, but also being seen to be doing the right thing. There's a broader scope extending the corporate responsibility to aspects like sustainability. It's not purely just the well-being purely of the company. It is the sustainability and the sustainable development of the company. And stakeholders go beyond just shareholders, management, and board. It goes to many other groups that we at MTR touch on. It would be our riders, it would be people using our shopping centers, it would be government being an important stakeholder. It is balancing for us the requirements of all these stakeholders. So, are we handcuffed or are we hands-on? I suppose one could look at being handcuffed in terms of the structures, the oversight which are required. And that would be board oversight, that could be more board committee oversight. 10 years ago, we at MTR, we had 3 board committees. We had an audit committee, we had a remuneration committee, and we had a nomination committee. 10 years later, we now have 5 board committees. The 3 that I mentioned. In addition to that, over the last 2 years or so, we've added a risk committee. We've added a capital works committee. So the amount of oversight which our board has on management, but also over the company, has, not surprisingly, evolved and increased over that period of time. The regulatory environment, something that we touched on previously. Compliance is an issue now for all businesses, not just financial services. And compliance, not just in one jurisdiction, but I'm sure, as many of you know, in multiple jurisdictions. Disclosure relating to compliance, enhanced disclosure requirements. Also, not just in one jurisdiction, but in multiple jurisdictions. But beyond that set framework, and perhaps more the hands-on approach, the requirement and the increasing requirement to engage with different groups of stakeholders, to understand, maybe not agree all the time, but to understand different viewpoints. The need to be agile and to be responsive to change. We've seen significant change over the last 10 years. We're going to see even more significant change over the next 10, 15, 20 years. The advent of social media is only but one of those drivers for change. And for us, importantly, as part of that hands-on approach, corporate governance goes beyond rules and procedures. Corporate governance for us is a culture. It's a culture of delivering sustainable, high-integrity business for all our stakeholders. So the enhancement of a culture that embraces that concept is for us very important. So our conclusion, I suppose, is that corporate governance from a management perspective is neither hands-on nor handcuffed. It's a combination of both and more. It is working for management to work together with the board and other stakeholders to deliver that sustainable return for all stakeholders. We at MTR, and looking at this balancing stakeholder requirement, we really have 2 birth certificates. When MTR was founded 40 years ago, we were founded as the metro public transport operator here in Hong Kong. Our obligation, our requirement, was to deliver a high level of service for all our passengers in a sustainable way. Since the year 2000, we've been listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. That original birth certificate has been complemented by a dual birth certificate. Now, our obligations are not only to provide that high level of services to passengers, which remains a requirement, but balancing then that against the needs of a public company and another very important stakeholder group, which would be our shareholders. Compliance, timely and accurate disclosure of information, that is just going to become more and more important over time. And the amount of disclosure and compliance will just grow over time. If we reflect back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the compliance and the regulations that we have to comply with versus today, it is a multitude increase. Stakeholder, I've spent a lot of time talking about stakeholders. We at MTR are truly of the view that stakeholders, and this is reflected in our annual report. Our annual report is not addressed just to our shareholders. Our annual report is addressed to shareholders and other stakeholders. It is ultimately a balancing of the requirements of these different stakeholders. And in the midst of that, we are learning to be more responsive. The world is changing around us with social media, with many other developments. We are learning to respond to that changing environment. So with that, thank you very much. That concludes my presentation.
Our second speaker is Ms. Edith Shi, Head Group General Counsel and Company Secretary of CK Hutchison Holdings Limited. Ms. Shi looks at the role of the company secretary as the gatekeeper of a company. She examines the types of regulatory chains that companies are faced with and considers how the gatekeeper might uncuff those chains.
The topic today is management in CG, hands-on or handcuffed, the gatekeeper to uncuff the chains. This is the gate. Who's the gatekeeper? Who is the company secretary? We've always called ourselves the lead gatekeeper, the conscience of the company. The gatekeeper's job. How do gatekeepers uncuff the chain? Hands-on governance is the key word. To ensure that the company abides by all applicable laws, codes, regulations, and commitments, and also to inculcate and enhance good corporate governance within the company and beyond. Now, it's not just the company secretary, as we have seen, from top to bottom and from bottom to top. Everybody, including the cleaning lady and your guard in the office, they are the ones that should remember to turn off the light when nobody's in the office, ESG. So, hands-on management to uncuff the chain. What chains are there? Now, I'm speaking about my understanding of the chains that I have to look after as head of legal and compliance. And within the company and your corporations, there would be other chains if you are looking after finance or treasury or insurance, etc. So for legal and company secretary, the company's ordinance is a very important piece of legislation, which is one of our chains. This applies to both private as well as listed companies. Securities and Futures Ordinance, basically listed companies only. In particular, what we're very familiar with is the SFO filings. As with the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, these are the listing rules and regulations. We all remember Chapter 13, 14, 14A, as well as Appendix 10. Listed companies also takeovers code. And there might be other regulatory and legal chains that you are subject to. For us, for example, as a company that operates a telephone company, the telecoms ordinance, for those of you that are in the banking industry, the banking ordinance, and everyone now is subject to the competition ordinance and many others. So what other handcuffs are there in addition to legal and regulatory? Look at the company. Our own constitutional documents, your articles, governs how the company should behave. What is the quorum? Is it always 2? Are you now allowed to have electronic meetings? So written resolutions, is it simple majority or unanimous approval? These are all in our constitutional documents. Shareholders' agreements, maybe we have joint venture partners, so what you see in terms of shareholding, for example, 70-30, might not be the real control and authority. A 30% shareholder might be given the right to veto the 70%. So don't just look at the numbers, look at your own shareholders' agreement, whether the minority shareholder has a veto right on certain important matters. Our contractual commitments to banks, to our creditors, to our suppliers, etc. Our own company's philosophy, our culture. There are many companies having listed, do not remember that they are a listed company and they still do things in the normal way as they did in the past. And of course, companies would have their own practices and procedures and policies. For example, signing mandate, who can sign bank accounts, who can sign documents, and how much are they allowed to be responsible for? So in a company, bottom to top signing, so far as we're concerned, if there is a resolution for signing by the board, we have 18 directors. We start with the most junior and then go the way up until we reach the chairman. Why are we doing that? It's so as to ensure that when the chairman signs, he knows that everybody else is aware of what's happening and have signed off. So all these chains and handcuffs instill good governance. So how do we get uncuffed? First, we must know the law, regulations, commitments, and stakeholders' expectations. We have to know what these chains are. Ignorance is no defense. Understand the strengths and weaknesses of one's company on compliance. For example, a PLC is always a weak link for us, so we pay special attention to our China operations. We have a research and development pharmaceutical company in China, and all the scientists are stationed in Shanghai. One day, I went there and discovered that the notebooks that they put their findings every day were not properly stored and updated every night. So if something happens to the notebook, the findings that people have worked on for months and years would disappear. And because of that, we put in a system to ensure that the notebooks are updated properly and kept in safe storage. Analyze and tackle weakness. When we know what the weaknesses are, we know what to do. And of course, we also enlist the help of our internal audit department to go for frequent visits. Garner board and senior management support, employee buy-in. I always find this very interesting. My strongest ally is innets, especially those that are from abroad. They keep on sending me articles, passages about governance, so I can circulate to everybody. That saves my time convincing them, because one of the directors actually provided that. Employee endorsement is, of course, most important. The last person to leave the office does not turn off the light, so that's one point off the ESG report. devise plans, procedures, policies to implement and enhance governance. And we do have quite a lot of these within the company. And these are subject to re-examination, updating continually. And obviously, continuing education, we have to educate our newcomers within the company so that they have the basic knowledge of what the company's procedures are. And one step at a time. Sometimes you look at the mountain, it's very high. It's very difficult to climb. But if you just don't start working on it, you'll never get there. But don't expect to get there in a leap, and be patient. I want to give you two specific examples as to how we deal with two major chains. And of course, one size doesn't fit all. And I'm sure different companies would have different ways of dealing with their chains as well. Now, the first one is directors and employee securities dealings. This is something that we're all very familiar with. For listed companies, we all have the share dealing code. And in our code, it's provided that if a director or senior management wants to deal, they have to provide a request to the chairman or a main board director asking for permission to deal. And the permission will be given, and from that day on, they have to consummate the transaction within 5 days. And all of these paperwork is copied to the company secretary. So the company secretary is totally aware of what's going on in terms of dealings. Because after that, he or she might be asked to help with the SFO filings. Blackout period reminders, we send this out regularly during result announcement period. For the final results, everybody knows is 60 days. And for interim, 30 days. This is sent to all directors and also to employees. We have 4 tiers of announcements. For those colleagues that are involved in finance and accounting, they have the same blackout period, 60 days or 30 days. Senior management with no information whatsoever on the figures of the company, such as the HR department or the Treasury department, there is no blackout period for them. The PR, as well as ComSec departments, we are subject to 2 weeks of blackout period, because by then we would get involved. There are also subgroup senior management. They have no blackout period. This is one type of reminder. This is regular results announcement. There's another type called PSI reminder. And during this period, if you receive a reminder of this sort, there is absolutely no dealings. All right, let's look at another one. This is for regulatory disclosure. We adopt a legal policy. This one was written up when I first became General Counsel 23 years ago. This policy requires our group colleagues to send out transactions that are of a certain value. Now, it started with the 20 million Hong Kong dollars. Now it is 100 million. So anything below 100 million is okay. You don't have to let head office know. But if it is 100 million, come to me. And all financing documentation are organized by head office, as well as all documents involving joint venture partners. And how do we capture this? We have a system called LexTrack. So with this LexTrack, I'm able to keep track of what's happening, and when the transaction is finally completed, the documentation will be archived in the system. So we keep good track of what we do. Now, as for price-sensitive information, we have what we call the Skynet. Another, whether you call it chain or key to uncuff the chain, is our size test chart. Every year after announcement of results, whether it's a final or interim, our finance department would come up with a size test chart. We do a lot of continuing professional development work for new members. Everybody in the legal department, in the finance department, and the corporate secretarial department, they don't have to know all these rules, but they need to have a working knowledge of all these requirements so that when they see one, that they can recognize it. And then the expert team will be there to do the work. So actually, these are chains, but they are also governance tools. And the gatekeeper's job is to use an appropriate key to uncuff the chains. When compliance is attained, there are no chains to uncuff. That's all from me. Thank you.